Sloane Barrett had spent 5 years imagining freedom as something quiet. In her mind, it had always looked like a road stretching away from prison, a paper cup of coffee warm in her hands, and the simple relief of making one decision without asking permission. The reality lasted 11 seconds. A freezing wind swept across the entrance of the women's correctional facility in upstate New York as Sloane stepped beyond the outer gate. Snow covered surrounding fields and bare trees, turning everything white and painfully beautiful. Behind her, steel fencing disappeared beneath frost. Ahead of her waited an empty road, and a bus stopped nearly half a mile away. At 30, Sloane carried everything she owned inside one state-issued plastic bag. There was no family waiting. Her father had died during her 3rd year inside. The few friends who had promised to stay in contact eventually stopped writing. Bryce Hale, the boyfriend whose pressure and manipulation had helped push her into the burglary that destroyed her life, had disappeared long before sentencing. Sloane had never pretended she was completely innocent. She had driven the car. She had understood enough to know Bryce was committing a crime. Fear had influenced her choices, but it had not erased them. 5 years had given her plenty of time to understand that difference. Now she wanted nothing dramatic. A bus, a cheap room, work nobody else wanted, a life small enough that dangerous people would stop noticing her. Then engines approached from behind the curve. 3 black SUVs moved slowly toward the prison entrance. Sloane stopped walking. The vehicles pulled alongside the road with unsettling precision. Doors opened almost simultaneously. Men in dark tailor coats stepped onto the snow. They were not correctional officers. They were not federal agents. Their movements were too controlled, their attention too focused. Sloane recognized the type immediately. Elise had warned her about men like these. Inside prison, rumors traveled faster than official announcements, and one name carried more weight than most. Gideon Shaw, a New York Mafia Don whose legitimate businesses stretched through freight companies, private clubs, construction contracts, and labor organizations. The stories surrounding him were less consistent than the fear attached to his name. Sloane had never met him. That made seeing his men outside the prison even worse. The tallest of them approached without touching her. His posture remained professional, almost formal, but nothing about the situation felt optional. He informed her that transportation had been arranged. Gideon Shaw needed information concerning a woman who was dead. Sloane felt the cold differently after that. She could have refused. Technically, but she was standing beside an isolated winter road with 3 vehicles, several men, no phone service worth trusting, and nowhere close enough to run without being followed. So she entered the SUV. Snow-covered Hudson Valley roads passed beyond tinted windows as they drove south. Sloane remained silent, watching frozen fields and distant hills while trying to understand how men she had never met knew her exact release time. Then she noticed her prison number printed on a document resting near the security chief. They knew more than her release date. They knew what property had been returned to her. They knew which cell block she had lived in. They knew Elise. An hour later, iron gates opened before a secluded riverside estate overlooking the winter Hudson. Inside, Sloane was brought to a quiet study where a man stood beside tall windows facing the gray river. Gideon Shaw looked nothing like the uncontrolled monster prison rumors had created. He was calm. That was worse. On the desk before him sat a photograph. Sloane recognized the woman instantly. Elise Shaw, the inmate she had protected for nearly 2 years. The woman who had died 6 months earlier. Only then did Sloane learn the truth. Elise had been Gideon's estranged younger sister. He placed another photograph beside the first. Elise was holding a newborn baby. Every official record claimed the child had died inside the prison hospital. Sloane stared at the photograph, and the blood drained from her face, because she knew the baby had left that hospital alive. Sloane's final sentence changed the temperature of the room. The baby had left the prison hospital alive. Gideon did not react with anger. He simply became still, staring at the photograph as the winter Hudson moved beyond the mansion windows. He had expected Sloane to fear him. What unsettled him was realizing she feared telling him the truth even more than she feared what he might do to her. The estate was warm, elegant, and silent, but Sloane felt no freer than she had behind prison walls. Guards stood beyond the study doors. Cameras watched the grounds. Every polished surface reminded her that control could look beautiful and still remain control. Gideon finally explained why Elise had disappeared from his life. Years earlier, she had accused someone inside the Shaw organization of using legitimate trucking routes to move illegal cargo. Gideon had dismissed her accusations as reckless paranoia. When Elise was later arrested on narcotics charges, he believed she had fallen into the very world she claimed to oppose. He had been wrong about more than he wanted to admit. The Elise Sloane knew had been careful, intelligent, and constantly afraid of being watched. Inside prison, Elise had become one of the only people who treated Sloane as something more than an inmate number. She shared food, warned her about dangerous alliances, and never asked questions about the worst parts of her past. But Elise guarded one secret obsessively: her pregnancy. When she eventually gave birth under prison supervision, officials announced that the premature infant had died. Sloane had believed it for less than an hour. That night, while returning from a cleaning assignment through a restricted service corridor, she saw a prison nurse moving quickly toward a rear exit. The woman was carrying a newborn. The child was breathing. Days later, Elise confirmed enough for Sloane to understand that someone had arranged to move her daughter before powerful people could use the baby against her. Sloane did not know where the child had been taken. Gideon believed her. The harder truth came next. Elise had warned Sloane that someone extremely close to Gideon could not be trusted. For the first time, real pain broke through his composure. His own sister had trusted a convicted stranger more than the brother, who commanded hundreds of men. Shortly before Elise died, she had given Sloane a small silver locket and instructed her never to surrender it merely because someone carried the Shaw name. Sloane had hidden it inside the lining of her prison property bag. She retrieved it now. Gideon could have taken it. He did not. That restraint became the first thing about him Sloane had not expected. Inside the locket was no photograph, only a tiny engraved bird and a date. Gideon recognized the symbol immediately. It had once appeared throughout a private Manhattan social club owned by his grandfather, a place the Shaw family had abandoned years ago. Elise had left a trail, but she had designed it so Gideon could follow only if Sloane decided he deserved the next step. Before they could leave, Gideon's security chief entered carrying Sloane's plastic prison bag. The seal along one edge had been cut and carefully melted shut again. Someone had searched her belongings before she ever walked through the prison gates. The cut seal on Sloane's prison bag changed everything. Gideon's men had been waiting outside the prison. Someone else had reached her before she ever crossed a gate. By afternoon, Gideon moved the investigation into Manhattan, where Elise's silver locket pointed toward an abandoned Shaw family club near the river. The restored building had polished walnut walls, tall arch windows, and a view of winter sunlight flashing across the Hudson. The club was closed to guests. Only Gideon, Sloane, and a small security team entered. In the basement archive, Sloane found the same engraved bird from Elise's locket carved into a row of old family storage lockers. One locker had been accessed shortly before Elise's arrest. Inside was no money. There were childhood photographs, hospital records, folded papers, and several pages covered with handwritten dates. At first, Gideon saw nothing unusual. Sloane did. 5 years in prison had taught her to measure life through transfers, count times, medical calls, and unit changes. Several dates matched periods when Elise had suddenly been moved from one prison block to another. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Someone outside the prison had been receiving updates almost immediately. Gideon confirmed his organization had not ordered surveillance on Elise. That meant another network had access to correctional employees. Sloane remembered things she had once dismissed as ordinary prison corruption. Inmates quietly moving medication between units, phones appearing after lockdown, packages changing hands in laundry rooms, women pressured into carrying objects they were never allowed to inspect. Elise had noticed it too. She had apparently been building a record of the system before her arrest. The implication disturbed Gideon more than any rival family could have. This was not an enemy attacking from outside. Someone tied to the old Shaw structure had been operating through prisons for years without his knowledge. Several names were possible. One seemed impossible. Theodore Kessler had served beside Gideon's father, raised Gideon after his father's death, and remained his most trusted advisor for more than 2 decades. Gideon refused to accuse him without proof. Sloane respected that. Then she found the photograph. It showed a Shaw charity event from several years earlier. Men in suits stood near a loading entrance. One of them was Bryce Hale. Sloane stopped breathing. Bryce had once told her he worked temporary security jobs. He had never mentioned the Shaw family. Suddenly, the burglary that sent her to prison no longer felt separate from Elise's world. The thought was worse than guilt. It suggested someone may have understood Sloane's vulnerability long before she understood how easily Bryce could control her. Gideon immediately wanted her moved somewhere secure. Sloane refused. She had spent 5 years with other people deciding where she slept, when she ate, and which doors she could open. Protection that removed every choice did not feel like protection to her. Gideon listened. Instead of ordering her into another guarded room, he showed her the security reports and let her decide whether to continue. She chose to continue. Among Elise's papers, they found an address belonging to June Bell, a retired prison nurse now living near the Catskill Mountains. Sloane recognized the name. June was almost certainly the woman who had carried Elise's living baby through the service corridor. Gideon began preparing to drive north. Then one of his men called him toward the security monitor. Across the street, beneath falling snow, stood a familiar man staring directly at the club. Bryce Hale had found Sloane. Bryce's face on the security monitor erased any illusion that Sloane's past had stayed behind her. Within minutes, Gideon moved her out of Manhattan. The decision was not only about Bryce. Elise's trail still pointed north toward June Bell, and if the retired prison nurse truly knew what happened to the baby, they could not afford to wait. Snow thickened as they entered the Catskills. By evening, white covered the mountain roads and pine branches sagged beneath the weight. Visibility narrowed. Cell service weakened. The city disappeared behind them, replaced by steep slopes, frozen woods, and long stretches of road with nowhere to turn. Then traffic stopped. A vehicle sat sideways ahead, apparently crashed against a snowbank. Gideon's security team noticed the problem before Sloane did. There were no tire tracks leading into the impact. The accident had been staged. Movement appeared between the trees. Gideon's driver reversed before the road could be blocked completely, and the convoy escaped to a service route without allowing the encounter to become a firefight. The storm made continuing impossible. They reached a secluded cedar lodge owned through one of Gideon's legitimate companies, hidden among snow-covered pines beneath a mountain ridge. Security locked the property down immediately. Sloane hated the sound of every bolt. The reaction was automatic. Locked doors had meant counts, searches, permission, and years of having no control over where she could stand. Gideon noticed. Instead of increasing restrictions, he placed the lodge keys, a charge phone, and access to one of the vehicles on the table where she could reach them. If she wanted to leave, he would not physically stop her. That choice affected Sloane more than any promise of protection could have. For 5 years, freedom had been treated as something she had forfeited. Gideon was the first dangerous man in her life, who seemed willing to protect her without demanding ownership in return. That night, Sloane finally told him the truth about Bryce. Bryce had controlled her money, isolated her from friends, and slowly trained her to doubt her own judgment. When the burglary happened, Sloane drove the car. She knew enough to understand something criminal was happening. That was the part she never tried to erase. Prison had punished her crime, but it also forced her to understand how often she confused obedience with love. Gideon did not excuse her. He respected that she did not excuse herself. In return, Sloane began recognizing his own guilt. Gideon had been raised by a father who believed fear created loyalty faster than trust ever could. Gideon had reduced some of the violence he inherited, but he had still benefited from the system. Elise had apparently understood something he had not. Changing methods was not the same as changing what power meant. Their connection deepened without declarations. Trust formed through smaller things. Distance given when Sloane needed it. Information shared instead of withheld. Decisions made together rather than for her. Near midnight, confirmation arrived that June Bell was alive and still living near a frozen lake farther north. Then another report followed. The men behind the road ambush had known Gideon's exact route out of Manhattan. Only 5 people had been given that information. Before dawn, his security chief discovered footprints beneath Sloane's bedroom window. Seconds later, Gideon's phone received an anonymous photograph. It showed Sloane asleep inside the lodge. The photograph of Sloane sleeping inside the lodge proved one thing with absolute certainty. Someone close to Gideon was feeding information to the enemy. Before sunrise, he changed everything. The route north was selected personally. Only 2 members of a security team knew the destination, and even they were given it in stages. By late morning, Gideon and Sloane were deeper in the Catskills, where the roads narrowed between snow-heavy trees and the mountains seemed to swallow every sound. June Bell lived beside a frozen lake in an old timber house, surrounded by white woods. The place looked peaceful enough to belong in another life. June did not react peacefully when Gideon stepped from the SUV. Her fear was immediate. She recognized the Shaw name before he ever reached the porch. Elise had warned her that someday someone from her family might come looking for the child. Sloane was the only reason the door opened. Inside the warm house, June finally confirmed what Sloane had witnessed years earlier. She had been the nurse carrying Elise's newborn daughter to the prison service corridor. The infant had never died. The death certificate had been fabricated. Elise believed someone intended to use her daughter as leverage. So June helped move the baby through protective foster arrangement under another identity. The child was nearly 2 years old now. Her name was Wren. For months, Gideon had mourned a niece he believed he would never meet. Now he discovered she had spent her entire life hidden from him. That truth hurt more than the deception. Elise had not hidden Wren because she hated her brother. She had hidden the child because she believed proximity to Gideon Shaw could get her killed. Sloane watched him absorb that, without trying to soften it. Power had protected Gideon for years. For everyone around him, it had sometimes created the danger. June revealed the reason Elise had become so afraid. She had uncovered a smuggling network operating through correctional facilities, supported by corrupt prison employees, outside couriers, and someone inside the Shaw organization. Elise intended to expose it. Before she could, the narcotics case against her had been manufactured. Bryce Hale had worked as one of the network's outside couriers. The photograph from the Manhattan archive had not been coincidence. Sloane's relationship with Bryce had placed her close to the same criminal structure long before she ever met Elise. She felt something inside her shift. For years, she had believed Bryce belonged to a terrible but finished chapter. Now his shadow reached all the way into the prison life she thought had been separate. June explained that Wren was no longer staying at the lake house. Too many suspicious vehicles had appeared nearby in recent weeks. A trusted caretaker was protecting her a short drive away. Gideon immediately wanted to go. Sloane insisted that Wren should not meet her uncle surrounded by armed men in fear. Gideon accepted her judgment. It was another small decision, but Sloane noticed what it meant. He was learning that protecting someone did not always require controlling the room. For the first time since the prison gates opened, Sloane allowed herself to imagine that survival might eventually become a life. Then June's phone rang. The caretaker sounded frightened. A man had arrived asking questions about Wren. June listened to the description, and the color drained from her face. The man outside Wren's hiding place was Theodore Kessler, the person Gideon had trusted more than anyone since his father's death. Theodore Kessler had been beside Gideon since childhood. That made the betrayal more dangerous than anything an enemy could have planned from outside. Gideon's first instinct was to go after him immediately. Sloane stopped that impulse before it became a mistake. If Theodore truly controlled part of the prison network, attacking him too soon would warn every officer, courier, and associate connected to it. Wren mattered more than revenge. They reached the caretaker's house before Theodore could take the child. He had already left. The rooms were quiet when Gideon finally saw his niece for the first time. Wren stood near the window, holding a small stuffed bird against her chest. She had Elise's eyes. That detail broke through Gideon's control more effectively than any threat ever had. For nearly 2 years, this child had existed beyond his knowledge, while his sister had built layer after layer of protection around her. Then Gideon noticed the bird. Its shape matched the symbol engraved inside Elise's locket. The realization came slowly. Elise had not simply left clues. She had created a test. Anyone with enough force could have taken the locket from Sloane. Anyone with enough men could have searched the Shaw properties. But Elise had designed the trail, So Gideon would only reach Wren if he learned to listen to the woman carrying the truth. Sloane understood it too. Elise had trusted that character would reveal itself before the trail was complete. Theodore's motive became clearer through records June had preserved. For years, Gideon had been reducing the most violent operations inherited from his father. Theodore saw those changes as betrayal. To him, the old Shaw Empire had been built through fear, prison connections, and people who could be controlled because nobody powerful cared what happened to them. Elise discovered Theodore had quietly kept that system alive. When she threatened to expose it, her narcotics arrest was arranged. When she continued investigating from prison, Theodore arranged her death. Wren was supposed to disappear with her. June had ruined that part. Bryce Hale had also served Theodore's system. He recruited desperate outsiders for criminal work that could be abandoned the moment something went wrong. Sloane had been one of them. There had been no elaborate plan targeting her years in advance. Bryce had simply recognized someone he believed he could control. That truth hurt, but it also showed Sloane how much she had changed. Theodore's entire network depended on vulnerable people remaining obedient. Sloane no longer was. Gideon understood that killing Theodore would solve almost nothing. The prison network would survive unless they exposed everyone supporting it. June revealed that Elise had hidden her complete evidence inside a decommissioned correctional work farm where she and Sloane had once been transferred during renovations. Sloane knew the property. The thought of returning terrified her. Gideon gave her the choice to remain behind with Wren. Sloane chose to go. Elise had died protecting her right to make that decision. They were preparing to leave when the caretaker suddenly called for Gideon. Wren's room was empty. On the bed lay one object, Sloane's old prison identification card. The morning Sloane left prison, she had promised herself she would never willingly walk into another cell. Days later, she was heading back toward one. Theodore had taken Wren to the abandoned correctional work farm, where Elise had once hidden her evidence. The compound sat against a frozen woodland, its empty building surrounded by snow, rusted fencing, and silent guard towers. Gideon wanted to move fast. Sloane knew that would be dangerous. She remembered the service tunnels, maintenance corridors, and blind corners from the months she had spent there during a prison renovation. If Gideon stormed the property, Theodore could move Wren before anyone reached her. For once, Gideon did not try to overpower the situation. He followed Sloane's plan. That choice mattered. The man who had once believed control was the same thing as protection was now trusting a former inmate to lead him through the place that had once stripped her of every choice. Sloane entered through an old maintenance passage behind the laundry building. The smell of concrete and rust hit her first. Then came the memories. Count lines, locked doors, being searched, being addressed by a number instead of a name. For one painful moment, the compound felt larger than she remembered. Then Sloane understood something. The building still remembered who she had been. She did not have to become that woman again. Her knowledge of the prison became an advantage. She guided Gideon through forgotten staff corridors until they reached the abandoned chapel. Behind a sealed wall panel, they found what Elise had died protecting. Documents, audio recordings, names, payment records. The evidence connected Theodore to corrupt prison officers, outside couriers, staged narcotics arrests, and the operation that had eventually led to Elise's death. It was enough to destroy more than one man. Gideon immediately transmitted copies to legitimate attorneys and federal contacts before Theodore could erase anything. That decision ended the possibility of burying the truth inside mafia retaliation. Theodore realized too late that control had already slipped away. He tried one final tactic. He exposed Bryce's connection to Sloane and attempted to make her look like part of the same criminal network. Years earlier, that accusation might have broken her. Gideon refused to let it. Sloane's past was real, but it did not belong to Theodore. Using an old staff corridor, she located the room where Wren was being held. Gideon reached his niece without turning the rescue into the bloodbath Theodore expected. Once Theodore's supporters learned the evidence had already been copied and released, their loyalty collapsed almost immediately. Fear had kept them beside him. Fear could not save him anymore. Theodore was taken into custody as the network around him began unraveling. Later, Sloane walked back to the compound carrying Wren in her arms. The symbolism was impossible to miss. Years earlier, prison had reduced Sloane to a number. Now she was leaving those walls by choice, carrying someone else toward freedom. Gideon watched her cross the snow and understood that nothing about her strength had come from him. Then an investigator approached with one final recovered file. Inside was a payment record made to Bryce Hale 3 days before Sloane's arrest 5 years earlier. The payment to Bryce Hale raised one final question, but it did not erase what had already changed. Several months passed before Sloane allowed herself to believe the worst was truly behind her. By early spring, the Hudson Valley looked different. Snow had withdrawn from the hills, leaving wet earth, pale grass, and sunlight moving across a river. The same estate where Sloane had once arrived believing she exchanged one prison for another now felt quieter. Not harmless, just different. Gideon had spent those months dismantling the operations Theodore had protected. Prison smuggling routes were closed. Senior Shaw figures tied to the network were removed. Legitimate freight, hospitality, and property businesses remained, but Gideon placed them under tighter oversight. Federal investigations continued independently. He did not try to make every consequence disappear simply because he had the influence to interfere. Wren remained under legal protection, while Gideon pursued guardianship through attorneys and family court. For the first time in generations, a Shaw child would not be raised as a secret. Sloane built something separate. She rented a modest apartment of her own and began training with an organization that helped formerly incarcerated women find housing, employment, identification documents, and basic stability after release. She understood how dangerous the first days of freedom could be. Sometimes a person left prison with nowhere to sleep, nobody waiting, and exactly enough desperation for the wrong person to become powerful again. Sloane wanted fewer women standing alone on roads the way she had. Gideon offered financial support. She accepted only after the program was structured, so he could never control it. He respected the boundary. That mattered more than the money. Their relationship grew, without becoming another arrangement of dependence. Gideon never treated protecting her as a favor that demanded affection in return. Sloane never pretended his past had vanished simply because he was changing. What connected them was more difficult than fantasy: accountability. Gideon had learned that power was not proven by deciding who stayed. Sometimes it was proven by opening the door. Sloane became close to Wren, partly because she carried memories of Elise that the little girl would someday deserve to know. Gideon eventually understood why Sloane had mattered from the beginning. It was not because she had been vulnerable. It was because she kept choosing truth, even when truth made her less safe. Bryce was arrested after Theodore's records exposed his role in the courier network. Sloane did not visit him. She did not need revenge, closure, or one final moment where he saw how much stronger she had become. Her victory was simpler. Bryce no longer influenced a single decision she made. One bright afternoon, Sloane stood at Gideon's Hudson estate preparing to return to her apartment. Months earlier, men had brought her through those gates because she believed she had no real choice. Now Gideon stood several feet away and made no attempt to stop her. Sloane looked toward the open door. Then she stayed a little longer. Not because he asked, because she wanted to. For the first time, that made all the difference. Later that evening, Sloane opened the final recovered file connected to Bryce's mysterious payment. The transfer had not originated with Theodore. It came from someone neither Sloane nor Gideon recognized. And the attached records proved that stranger had been watching Sloane before she ever went to prison.